The leather briefcase snapped shut with a sound that cut through the Phoenix courtroom like a gunshot. I watched David Chen, my husband's attorney, stuffing papers into his bag with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. The manila envelope I just handed Judge Martinez sat there on her bench, still sealed, but somehow David already knew his case was over. His face had turned the color of old paper. Marcus kept tapping his wedding ring against the table. Tap, tap, tap. The same nervous habit he'd had since I met him, except now it sounded like a countdown timer. The courtroom had gone so quiet you could hear the air conditioning humming through the vents. Even the court reporter had stopped typing. My name is Sarah Hartwell. I'm 42 years old, and 6 hours ago, I was still Sarah Mitchell. I never imagined I'd be sitting in Superior Court watching the man I'd loved for 6 years try to steal everything my grandmother died protecting. But here I was, holding the one piece of paper that would destroy his plan completely. David Chen looked up from his briefcase and caught my eye. For just a second, I saw something close to fear flash across his face. He knew what was in that envelope. Maybe not the details, but he knew enough to realize his client had lied to him about everything. Marcus was still tapping that ring, faster now. He had no idea what was coming. No idea that the secret I'd discovered wasn't just about my inheritance. The most dangerous truth in that envelope was about him, about who he really was, about what he'd done before he ever met me. And in about 30 seconds, Judge Martinez was going to open it.
But let me back up. Let me tell you how I got here, sitting in this courtroom watching my marriage dissolve in real time. Because the story doesn't start with Marcus. It starts with Rose. My grandmother, Rose Hartwell, was everything to me. She had to be. When I was 12 years old, my parents died in a head-on collision on Interstate 17 during a December snowstorm. One phone call changed everything. Rose didn't hesitate. She drove down from Flagstaff in her old Buick, packed up my entire life, and brought me home to her 1920s craftsman house in the historic Roosevelt district of Phoenix. That house. God, I loved that house. Rose had bought it in 1963 for $8,000, when the neighborhood was still rougher on the edges. She spent 40 years turning it into something magical. Hand-carved crown molding, original hardwood floors that creaked in all the right places, a kitchen with subway tiles she'd installed herself, tile by tile. The backyard was her masterpiece. Roses everywhere, each bush planted to mark a family milestone. The climbing rose by the back gate was for my high school graduation. The white tea roses along the fence were for my college acceptance letter. Rose didn't just give me a home. She gave me a purpose. While other kids my age were worried about dating and mall trips, I was learning about compound interest and investment portfolios. Rose had built a small fortune through careful investing in real estate, and she made sure I understood every dollar. Saturday mornings were spent at her kitchen table going through her financial statements. She'd quiz me on dividend yields and explain why she never trusted get-rich-quick schemes. "Money doesn't make you rich, sweetheart," she'd say, stirring her coffee with that little silver spoon she'd inherited from her own grandmother. "Wisdom makes you rich. Money just makes you comfortable." I carried that wisdom with me through Arizona State University, where I worked 3 jobs to pay my way. Campus bookstore clerk during the day, restaurant server at night, weekend tutor for struggling business students. Rose offered to pay my tuition, but I was stubborn. I wanted to earn it myself. What I didn't realize was that every dollar I saved, every shift I picked up, was another night Rose spent alone in that big house, reading her books and tending her roses. By the time I graduated with my degree in finance, Rose was 78 and starting to slow down. I had a job offer in San Francisco with a major investment firm. Great salary, fast track to partnership, everything I'd worked for. But Rose needed me. She'd never ask, that wasn't her way, but I could see it in how she lit up when I visited, how she'd plan elaborate dinners for just the 2 of us, how she'd find excuses to call me 3 times a day. So I stayed. I turned down San Francisco and started my own financial advisory practice in Scottsdale. It was small at first, just me and a rented office space, but I was good at what I did. Rose had taught me well. I helped small business owners plan for retirement, guided young families through their first home purchases, and slowly built a reputation for being thorough and trustworthy. Rose was so proud. She'd brag about me to everyone, at the grocery store, at church, to the mailman. My granddaughter, Sarah, the financial advisor, she's going to be running her own firm someday. She was right, of course. By the time I turned 35, Hartwell Financial Planning had 12 employees and offices in both Scottsdale and Tempe. But success came at a cost. I'd spent my 20s and early 30s building my career and taking care of Rose. Dating was sporadic, relationships were shallow. I told myself I was too busy, too focused, but the truth was simpler. I was scared. Scared of losing someone else I loved. Rose was enough. Rose was safe. When Rose turned 85, the cancer came back. She'd beaten breast cancer once in her 60s, but this time it was in her bones, her liver. The oncologist in Phoenix was kind but clear. 6 months, maybe less. But there was a clinical trial in Houston, an experimental treatment that insurance wouldn't cover. $30,000 for a chance. I didn't hesitate. I liquidated my retirement accounts, took out a second mortgage on my condo, and maxed out every credit card I had. Rose fought me on it, said I was throwing away my future for a few extra months. But those months mattered. They were everything.
The treatment worked. Sort of. Instead of 6 months, we got 2 more years. 2 years of morning coffee in her kitchen. 2 years of Sunday dinners and Rose's stories about the old days. 2 years of her teaching me about the family trust she'd established, the careful legal protections she'd put in place to make sure our family's wealth stayed in the family. 2 years of her insisting I learn every detail of her estate planning, even though talking about it made us both cry. "Promise me something," she said during one of our last conversations. She was in hospice by then, the cancer finally winning despite all our fighting. "Promise me you'll be careful who you trust. Money changes people, Sarah. It makes them see you differently." I promised, but I didn't really understand what she meant. Not then. Rose died on a Tuesday morning in March, just as her roses were starting to bloom. I was holding her hand. Her last words were about the garden, reminding me to prune the climbers in late winter. Always practical, my Rose. The funeral was packed. Rose had touched so many lives in Phoenix through her volunteer work and her quiet generosity, but I felt completely alone standing at her graveside, watching them lower her into the ground next to my parents. At 36 years old, I was officially orphaned. That's when Marcus appeared. He came to the reception after the funeral, introduced himself as a pharmaceutical sales rep who'd worked with one of Rose's doctors. Tall, dark hair, kind eyes, and a gentle way of asking if I was okay. He stayed until the end, helped me clean up, and asked if he could take me to dinner the following week. Just to check on me, he said, make sure I was eating. I should have seen the red flags. Should have noticed how his eyes swept over Rose's house during the reception, cataloging the antique furniture and original artwork. Should have questioned how a sales rep could afford the expensive suit he wore, the luxury watch on his wrist. Should have wondered why he seemed to know so much about Rose's medical treatments and insurance coverage. But at the time, I thought he was just interested in my life. I thought he cared about understanding where I came from. I thought my devotion to family was my greatest strength, the thing that made me worth loving. I was about to discover that Marcus saw it as his greatest opportunity. Marcus proposed 8 months after Rose died. It was romantic, I'll give him that. Dinner at the Phoenician, champagne, a ring that probably cost more than most people make in 6 months. I said yes because I was tired of being alone, tired of coming home to an empty condo while Rose's house sat vacant across town, waiting for me to decide what to do with it. We married 6 months later in a small ceremony at Rose's house. I thought it would be meaningful, getting married in the place that had shaped me. Marcus suggested we could save money by having it there, which I appreciated at the time. Now I realize he was already calculating the property's value, already thinking of it as his.
The first few months of marriage were good. Marcus was attentive, supportive of my business, interested in my work. He moved into my Scottsdale condo, and we talked about eventually moving to Rose's house once I was ready. He seemed to understand that I needed time to process living in the place where she'd died. The shift started slowly. 3 months after the wedding, I found Marcus's laptop open on our kitchen counter. He'd stepped into the shower and a notification had popped up on his browser. I wasn't snooping, not intentionally, but I couldn't help seeing the search terms in his history. Arizona community property laws, challenging inheritance trusts in Arizona, spousal rights to family property acquired during marriage, how to contest a will in Arizona probate court. My stomach dropped. I closed the laptop and sat there for 20 minutes, trying to find an innocent explanation. Maybe he was researching for a friend. Maybe he was just curious about how inheritance law worked. Maybe he was trying to understand Rose's estate planning so he could help me manage it better. But deep down, I knew better. When Marcus came out of the shower, I asked him about it directly. He laughed, this cold, dismissive sound that I'd never heard from him before. "Sarah, honey, I'm just trying to understand our financial situation. We're married now. What's yours is mine, right? I want to make sure we're maximizing our assets." Our assets? He'd said our assets. The inheritance isn't a marital asset, Marcus. Rose set up a trust specifically to protect it. His smile faltered for just a second. "Trust me, sweetheart. I know more about legal loopholes than you think." That should have been my wake-up call, but I was still operating under the assumption that Marcus loved me, that he had my best interests at heart. I convinced myself he was just being practical, maybe a little over-eager about our financial future together. The escalation was gradual, but relentless. Marcus started bringing friends over to Rose's house, which I'd finally moved into 6 months after our wedding. I'd thought living there would help me feel closer to Rose, help me process my grief. Instead, I had to watch Marcus give tours like he was showing off his own property. "This is the original hardwood," he'd say to his pharmaceutical sales buddies, stomping on Rose's carefully preserved floors with his work boots. "These old places in Roosevelt District, they're gold mines if you know how to market them right." He started talking about improvements. The kitchen was outdated and needed modern appliances. The bathroom fixtures were vintage but not practical. The roses in the backyard were taking up space that could be used for entertaining. "We could put in a pool," he said one evening, standing at the kitchen window and looking out at Rose's garden. "Really modernize this place. Make it somewhere people actually want to visit." People do want to visit. I want to visit. This is Rose's garden. Every plant has meaning. Another one of those cold laughs. "Sarah, she's dead. Plants don't have feelings, but potential buyers do. And they want to see modern landscaping, not some old lady's rose collection." The way he said "old lady" made my skin crawl. But still, I made excuses. Marcus came from a different background. He didn't understand the emotional significance of family history. He was practical where I was sentimental. Then came the pressure about refinancing. Marcus had been researching the property values in our neighborhood, and he was excited about what he'd found. Rose's house was worth nearly twice what she'd paid for it, and the historic district designation was driving values up even higher. "We're sitting on $800,000 in equity," he announced one morning over breakfast, spreading real estate pronouns across Rose's antique dining table. "We could refinance, pull out $500,000 and invest it. Real estate, stocks, maybe even that restaurant opportunity Jake was telling us about." "Marcus, I don't want to refinance Rose's house. It's paid off. That was important to her." "Rose isn't here anymore." His voice was getting sharper now, less patient with my objections. "You can't make financial decisions based on what a dead person would have wanted. We have opportunities here, Sarah. Real wealth-building opportunities. The house is my inheritance. It's protected by the trust Rose set up."
our inheritance," he corrected. "We're married. What's yours is mine, remember?" I was starting to remember a lot of things, like how Marcus had arrived at Rose's funeral in an expensive suit I'd never seen before, like how he knew details about her medical treatment that I'd never shared with him, like how he'd steered every early conversation towards our family's finances.
The breaking point should have been the phone calls. Marcus had started taking hushed conversations in the garage or stepping outside when certain numbers came up on his screen. When I walked into a room, he'd suddenly end the call or change the subject. When I asked who he'd been talking to, he'd brush me off. "Just work stuff, honey. Boring pharmaceutical sales nonsense. Nothing you'd be interested in." But I was interested, because those calls were happening at 8 p.m. on Sundays, at 6 a.m. on Saturday mornings, during times when no legitimate business would be conducting pharmaceutical sales. I started paying attention to the timing. Marcus would get a call, have one of his hushed conversations, and then suddenly bring up the house refinancing again, or he'd mention how much money we were wasting by not liquidating Rose's book collection, or he'd suggest we needed to diversify our portfolio by selling some of the antique furniture. Then came the reorganization. Marcus decided Rose's house office needed to be functional for our modern needs. Without asking me, he started moving her papers, her files, her carefully organized system for managing the trust and estate documents. I came home from work one day to find him in Rose's office, Rose's china cabinet pushed away from the wall, her delicate teacups and saucers stacked carelessly in cardboard boxes. "What are you doing?" "Making space," he said, not looking up from the filing cabinet he was emptying. "This room is wasted on storage. We could turn it into a real office, maybe even a media room." "Those aren't storage, Marcus. Those are Rose's personal papers, her financial records, family documents that go back generations." "Exactly. Old papers we don't need. I'm digitizing the important stuff and throwing away the rest." The sound of Rose's china clinking together in those boxes made me nauseous. She'd been so careful with those pieces, washing them by hand after every use, storing them with tissue paper between each plate. Now they were being treated like garage sale leftovers. "Stop." My voice was sharper than I intended. "Just stop. Put everything back where you found it." Marcus finally looked at me. "Sarah, you're being irrational. This is our house now. We can't turn it into a museum for a dead woman. Get out of this room, now." "Excuse me?" I said get out. Leave Rose's things alone. For a moment, something dangerous flashed in Marcus's eyes, something cold and calculating that I'd never seen before. Then the mask slipped back into place, and he was my concerned husband again. "Okay, honey, I'm sorry. I was just trying to help. We'll do this together when you're ready." But I wasn't ready, and deep down, I was starting to understand that I would never be ready to let Marcus destroy Rose's memory. What Marcus did on the first anniversary of Rose's death showed me he wasn't just greedy, he was calculating. I'd been dreading the date for weeks, March 15th, a year since I'd lost the most important person in my world. I'd planned to spend the day alone, visiting her grave, sitting in her garden, maybe reading through some of her old letters. Instead, I woke up to find Marcus in the kitchen making elaborate breakfast plans. "I thought we could have a memorial dinner tonight," he said, scrambling eggs with unusual enthusiasm. "Invite some friends over, share stories about Rose, really honor her memory properly." I was touched. For a moment, it felt like the Marcus I'd fallen in love with, the one who'd seemed to understand how much Rose meant to me. "That's thoughtful," I said, but I was hoping to keep it small, just the two of us. "Sarah, grief shouldn't be isolating. Rose would want us to celebrate her life with people who cared about her. I've already called a few people. Jake and Linda, Tom and Monica, maybe Patricia Hendricks if she's available." Patricia Hendricks, Rose's attorney. I hadn't spoken to her since the estate was settled, but the idea of having her there felt right.
Patricia had known Rose for 30 years. She could share stories I'd never heard. Okay, I agreed. That sounds nice. Marcus spent the entire day preparing. He cleaned the house from top to bottom, arranged flowers in Rose's good vases, even set the table with her best china. The same china he'd been carelessly boxing up 6 months earlier. He cooked Rose's favorite pot roast recipe, opened a bottle of wine she'd been saving for a special occasion. By evening, I was genuinely moved. Maybe I'd been wrong about Marcus's motives. Maybe grief had made me paranoid and suspicious. Maybe he really did want to honor Rose's memory. Our friends arrived around 7. Jake and Linda brought flowers. Tom and Monica shared funny stories about Rose's legendary Christmas cookies. Patricia Hendricks came with a bottle of Rose's favorite bourbon and tales of her early legal career that had us all laughing. It was perfect. For 3 hours, I felt connected to Rose again, surrounded by people who'd loved her. Marcus was the ideal host, making sure everyone's glass stayed full, encouraging people to share their favorite Rose memories. After dinner, Patricia pulled me aside in the kitchen. "How are you really doing, Sarah?" "Better tonight than I have in months," I admitted. This was exactly what I needed. Patricia nodded, but there was something in her expression I couldn't read. "Rose was proud of you, you know. She always said you were the smartest financial mind she had ever met. Said you had good instincts about people." "I hope so." "Trust those instincts," Patricia said quietly. "Rose always did." At the time, I thought she was just offering general life advice. Now I understand she was giving me a warning. The memorial dinner ended around 11. Marcus was tired from all the hosting, so I handled most of the cleanup while he said goodbye to our guests. I was washing dishes when I noticed something odd. Rose's office door, which I always kept closed, was slightly ajar. The light was on inside. I dried my hands and walked down the hall. Marcus was standing at Rose's desk, holding his phone, taking pictures of the documents spread across the surface. Rose's trust paperwork, her will, her financial statements, the private letters from her attorney about the estate structure. "Marcus, what are you doing?" He spun around, nearly dropping his phone. "Oh, Sarah, I thought I saw a light on in here. Wanted to make sure everything was secure after having people over." "Why were you taking pictures?" "Pictures? I wasn't... Oh, this?" He held up his phone like he'd forgotten it was there. "I was just documenting that everything was still organized properly. For insurance purposes." Even then, even with the evidence right in front of me, I wanted to believe him. Insurance doesn't need photos of Rose's personal documents. "You're right. I'm sorry. I guess I'm still in work mode. We have to document everything in pharmaceutical sales. Bad habit." Marcus put his phone away and guided me out of the office, switching off the light behind us. But I'd seen enough. Rose's papers had been arranged in neat piles, sorted by category. Someone had been going through them systematically. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Patricia's words. "Trust your instincts." Rose always did. My instincts were screaming.
The next morning, after Marcus left for work, I went into Rose's office and checked every document he'd photographed. Nothing was missing, but everything had been handled. I could see fingerprints on pages that I'd kept pristine since Rose's death. Then I remembered something. Rose had installed a security system 2 years before she died, after a series of break-ins in the neighborhood. The cameras were still active, still recording to a cloud storage system that I'd forgotten about. It took me 3 hours to figure out how to access the footage, but when I did, I found everything. Marcus hadn't just photographed Rose's documents during the memorial dinner. He'd spent 20 minutes in that office, carefully going through every file, photographing every page of her legal paperwork. He'd been systematic, organized, thorough. This wasn't curiosity or concern about security. This was reconnaissance. I checked his phone records online. Our cell phone plan gave me access to call logs and data usage. The day after our memorial dinner, Marcus had made 3 phone calls to numbers I didn't recognize. Long conversations, each lasting more than 30 minutes. I reverse searched the numbers. 2 were law offices specializing in the state litigation. The third was a private investigator who advertised services in asset recovery and inheritance disputes. Marcus hadn't organized a memorial dinner to honor Rose's memory. He'd done it to get access to her legal documents, to gather intelligence for the case he was already building against me. But I noticed something else that night, something that gave me hope for the first time in months. Patricia Hendricks had stayed late, helping with cleanup. I'd seen her watching Marcus carefully during dinner, studying him when he thought no one was looking. There had been something knowing in her expression, something that suggested she understood exactly what kind of man I'd married. She knew something I didn't, and she'd been waiting 20 years to tell me.
For 3 weeks after discovering the security footage, I lived in a strange kind of limbo. I knew Marcus was planning something, but I didn't know what or when. I found myself watching him constantly, analyzing every conversation, every phone call, every casual comment about our finances. Marcus, meanwhile, seemed completely normal. He brought me coffee in bed every morning, kissed me goodbye when he left for work, asked about my day when he came home. If I hadn't seen those photographs, hadn't traced those phone calls, I might have convinced myself I was being paranoid. But I wasn't paranoid. I was being hunted. The final straw came on a Tuesday evening in late April. Marcus was in the shower, and his laptop was open on our bed, connected to a charger. I wasn't planning to snoop, but a notification popped up on the screen. A new file had been saved to his desktop. Divorce Strategy, Final Draft, .docs. My hands were shaking as I opened it. 23 pages of detailed notes, legal research, and timeline planning. Marcus had been working on this for months, maybe since our wedding day. The document was organized like a business proposal, complete with bullet points and action items. Section 1 outlined Arizona's community property laws and how they applied to inheritances received during marriage. Section 2 detailed the grounds for challenging Rose's trust, including arguments about undue influence and lack of mental capacity in elderly individuals. But Section 3 made me physically ill. Documenting subject's mental state was the header. Underneath, Marcus had been keeping a detailed log of my behavior since Rose's death. Every time I'd cried while going through her belongings, every night I'd stayed up late reading her letters, every occasion when I'd gotten emotional talking about her memory. According to Marcus's notes, I was demonstrably unstable and unable to make rational financial decisions due to unresolved grief. He documented dates when I'd skipped social events to spend time at Rose's grave, times when I'd gotten upset about him moving her furniture, conversations where I'd mentioned feeling guilty about not spending more time with her before she died. All of it twisted into evidence that I was mentally unfit to manage Rose's inheritance. The timeline was even worse. Marcus planned to file for divorce in 6 weeks, right before our second wedding anniversary. His research showed that Arizona courts were more likely to grant significant asset redistribution in marriages lasting longer than 2 years. He was playing a waiting game, letting the calendar work in his favor. But the most damaging section was titled Emotional Manipulation Strategies. Marcus had identified my pressure points and documented how to exploit them. My guilt about Rose's death, my fear of being alone, my tendency to avoid conflict, my need for approval. He'd been using my grief as a weapon against me. There was more. Financial projections showing how he planned to liquidate Rose's estate, real estate listings for luxury condos in Scottsdale and vacation homes in Sedona, investment portfolios he wanted to establish with our money, a business plan for a restaurant venture with his friend Jake funded entirely by Rose's inheritance. At the bottom of the document
was a note to himself. Remember, S is emotionally driven, not logical. Use her attachment to dead grandmother as leverage. Court sympathetic to widowed spouse narrative. I printed the entire document, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Then I closed the laptop and sat there on our bed, staring at 23 pages of proof that my marriage was a lie. Marcus emerged from the bathroom 15 minutes later, towel wrapped around his waist, humming some tune I didn't recognize. He looked so normal, so innocent. If I hadn't just read his plans to destroy me, I might have told him about my day, asked about his work, maybe suggested we watch a movie together. Instead, I watched him get dressed and realized I was looking at a stranger. Everything about him was performance. The way he kissed my forehead goodnight, the way he asked if I needed anything before bed, the way he said "I love you" while checking his phone for messages. I didn't sleep that night. I lay there next to Marcus, listening to him breathe, trying to process the magnitude of his deception. 6 years of my life, 6 years of believing someone loved me when really he'd been running a long-term con. But it wasn't just about me. Marcus was planning to desecrate Rose's memory, to argue that she was mentally incompetent when she'd established the trust. He was going to drag her name through probate court, question her judgment, imply that she'd been manipulated in her final years. Rose, who was sharper at 87 than most people were at 40. Rose, who'd spent decades building wealth through careful investments and smart financial planning. Rose, who loved me enough to protect me from exactly this kind of predator. At 3 a.m, I got up and walked out to Rose's garden. The roses were in full bloom, the climbing rose by the back gate heavy with pink flowers. The air smelled like jasmine and night-blooming cereus, the same way it had when I was 12 years old, and Rose would bring me outside to look at the stars. I sat on the stone bench Rose had installed next to the tea roses, the ones that she'd planted for my college acceptance letter. Everything in this garden had meaning, had history, had love behind it, and Marcus wanted to rip it all out to install a pool. That's when I broke down completely. All the grief I'd been holding back since Rose's death, all the loneliness and fear and confusion came pouring out at once. I cried until I was empty, until there were no more tears left, until I was just sitting in Rose's garden at 4 a.m, surrounded by the roses she'd planted for every milestone in our family's life. And that's when I heard her voice. Not literally, I'm not claiming some supernatural experience, but I could hear Rose's words as clearly as if she was sitting next to me on that stone bench. "Sweetheart, some battles require strategy, not just strength." The grief didn't disappear. It crystallized into something harder, something colder, something more dangerous. Marcus thought he could use my love for Rose against me. He had no idea that love was about to become his worst nightmare. I sat in that garden until sunrise, and by the time the sky started turning pink, I wasn't the same person who discovered that document the night before. The grieving widow was gone. In her place was someone who'd learned strategy from one of the shrewdest financial minds in Phoenix. Rose hadn't just been my grandmother, she'd been my teacher, and she'd taught me that the best defense against predators was to be smarter, more prepared, and more ruthless than they expected. As I walked back toward the house, I started remembering things I'd forgotten, conversations with Rose that hadn't made sense at the time, her obsession with protecting the family legacy that seemed excessive for someone with my modest inheritance expectations, the mysterious meetings with lawyers that I wasn't allowed to attend. Rose would disappear for hours, claiming she had estate business to handle, always returning with a satisfied expression and a sealed envelope that went straight into her safe. Her cryptic comments about making sure the right person would inherit, no matter what. Her insistence that I learn every detail of the trust structure, even the parts that seemed irrelevant. Promise me you'll call Patricia Hendricks if you ever have questions about the estate, Rose had said during one of our last conversations. Promise me you'll trust her judgment even if it doesn't make sense at first. At the time, I thought she was just being thorough, maybe a little paranoid about legal complications. Rose had lived through the Depression. She understood that financial security could disappear overnight. But what if it wasn't paranoia? What if Rose had anticipated exactly the scenario? That conversation I dismissed as Rose's anxious rambling suddenly became the blueprint for Marcus's complete destruction. Rose knew. Somehow, she knew that someone might try to challenge the inheritance, might try to use my emotions against me, might try to argue that she wasn't mentally competent when she had established the trust. And she'd prepared for it. I spent the morning going through Rose's papers with new eyes, looking for clues I'd missed before. In her safe, behind the insurance policies and property deeds, I found a sealed envelope with my name written in Rose's careful handwriting. For Sarah only, to be opened if estate is challenged. Inside was a single sheet of paper with Patricia Hendricks' phone number and a note in Rose's hand. Call her immediately. Trust no one else. She has everything you need. Everything for what? Rose had died almost 2 years ago. What could Patricia possibly have that would help me now? But Rose had never steered me wrong, not once in 30 years of guidance and advice. I called Patricia that afternoon while Marcus was at work. Sarah? Patricia's voice was warm but unsurprised, like she'd been expecting my call.
How are you holding up, dear?
Not well, I admitted. Patricia, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Did Rose leave other instructions about the estate? Something I don't know about? There was a long pause. Can you come to my office this afternoon? There are some things we need to discuss in person. What kind of things? The kind Rose made me promise to keep secret until you asked the right questions. Patricia said quietly. She said you'd know when you were ready to hear the truth. I was ready. After 6 years of being manipulated and 2 years of being hunted, I was more than ready. I'll be there in an hour. Patricia Hendricks' law office occupied the top 2 floors of a historic building in downtown Phoenix, the kind of place that radiated old money and established power. I'd been there once before, during the initial estate settlement, but I'd been too deep in grief to appreciate the mahogany paneling and leather-bound law books that lined every wall. This time I noticed everything. The way Patricia's secretary immediately ushered me into the conference room without asking my name. The way Patricia closed the door behind us and activated a white noise machine before sitting down. The way she looked at me with a mixture of sadness and grim satisfaction. Rose said you'd figure it out eventually, Patricia began, settling into her chair with the deliberate movements of someone who'd been practicing law for 40 years. She hoped she was wrong, but she wasn't surprised when I called her that night after your memorial dinner. You called Rose? Rose has been dead for almost 2 years. Patricia smiled. I'm sorry. I meant she wasn't surprised when I told her about your husband at the memorial dinner. Rose had been expecting someone like Marcus since the day you got engaged. She pulled a thick manila folder from a locked filing cabinet behind her desk. The tab was labeled with my name, but underneath, in Rose's handwriting, were the words, Operation Safeguard. Your grandmother came to me 3 months before she died. She said she was worried about your future, specifically about the kind of man who might target you for your inheritance. But I didn't have an inheritance yet. Rose was still alive. Rose was 90 years old and terminally ill. She knew the money was coming to you, and she knew that kind of wealth makes you a target. She'd lived through it herself. She pulled out a black and white photograph from the 1960s,
A young Rose, maybe 30 years old, standing next to a handsome man in an expensive suit. Meet Rose's first husband, Thomas Hartwell. Charming, attentive, and completely broke. He married Rose for her family's real estate holdings and spent 3 years trying to gain control of her trust fund. When that failed, he tried to have her declared mentally incompetent. The photograph felt like looking into a funhouse mirror. Thomas Hartwell could have been Marcus's grandfather. The same confident smile, the same predatory calculation behind his eyes. What happened to him? Rose destroyed him, Patricia said simply. She was smarter than he gave her credit for, and she had better lawyers. By the time she was done, Thomas was bankrupt, disbarred from practicing law, and facing fraud charges in 3 states. He spent the rest of his life warning other con artists to stay away from the Hartwell family. I stared at the photograph, seeing Rose's story reflected in my own. She knew this would happen to me. She suspected it might. Rose understood that wealth attracts predators, and she'd spent 60 years watching wealthy women get taken advantage of by charming men. When you got engaged to Marcus, she asked me to run a background check. She pulled out another folder, this one labeled Marcus Mitchell, Personal Investigation. Inside were dozens of pages of financial records, court documents, and surveillance photographs. We started with his employment history, Patricia explained, spreading the documents across the conference table. Marcus has worked for 6 different pharmaceutical companies in the past 8 years. Each time he left under questionable circumstances, inappropriate relationships with clients, suspected kickback schemes, and ethical violations that were settled quietly. She handed me a stack of financial records. But the real pattern emerged when we looked at his personal relationships. Marcus has been engaged 4 times in the past 12 years. Each engagement ended when the woman discovered his true motives or when he realized she wasn't as wealthy as he had initially believed. The documents told a devastating story. Marcus had targeted a real estate heiress in San Diego, a tech entrepreneur's widow in San Francisco, and a rancher's daughter in Colorado. In each case, the pattern was identical: charming courtship, quick engagement, mysterious financial problems that required access to the woman's assets, and sudden disappearance when legal protections blocked his access. Jennifer Walsh in San Francisco is the one who talked. She's the tech widow. Marcus spent 2 years trying to gain access to her husband's estate before she figured out what he was doing. When she threatened to expose him, he moved to Phoenix and started fresh. And found me. And found you. Rose's investigation showed that Marcus researched your family's finances before he ever approached you at her funeral. He knew about her estate, knew about the inheritance you'd eventually receive, knew exactly how much you'd be worth.
The betrayal felt fresh all over again, but this time it was mixed with something else. Gratitude. Rose had tried to protect me even from beyond the grave. What else did she find? Patricia pulled out the thickest section of documents. Rose hired a private investigator to follow Marcus for 6 months during your engagement. We have photographs of him meeting with attorneys who specialize in inheritance disputes, financial records showing he took out loans against your future inheritance, credit card statements from expensive purchases he made while claiming to be financially struggling. The photographs were damning. Marcus in expensive restaurants with men in suits, shaking hands and exchanging documents. Marcus touring luxury cars and high-end condos. Marcus at meetings with financial advisors discussing investment strategies for anticipated assets. But the most devastating evidence was a series of recorded phone conversations. Rose's investigator had been thorough. How did you get these recordings? Marcus made a mistake, Patricia said. He discussed his plans with Jennifer Walsh, the tech widow from San Francisco. She'd been recording their conversations for months before she broke up with him, trying to gather evidence of his fraud. When Rose's investigator contacted her, she turned over everything. Patricia activated a digital recorder. Rose's voice filled the conference room, clear and unmistakable. "Sarah's perfect," he was saying to someone on the other end of the line. "She's isolated, still grieving her grandmother, completely dependent on me for emotional support. The inheritance is worth at least $2 million, maybe more if the real estate market keeps climbing. I just need to keep her happy for another year until we hit the 2-year mark for community property claims." The recording continued for 20 minutes. Marcus discussing his timeline for filing divorce papers, his strategy for claiming emotional distress damages, his plans for liquidating Rose's estate. He talked about me like I was a business acquisition, a financial asset to be exploited and discarded. "There are 12 hours of recordings," Patricia said, turning off the device, "all of them documenting Marcus's plans to defraud you and desecrate Rose's estate." I sat there in Patricia's conference room, surrounded by evidence of the most elaborate betrayal I could have imagined, and felt something I hadn't experienced in years: power. For the first time since Rose's death, I wasn't reacting to someone else's manipulation. I was holding the cards. "Rose created multiple layers of protection," Patricia continued. "The basic trust structure was just the beginning. She also established what we call a character clause in her estate planning." What's a character clause? It's a legal mechanism that prevents inheritance benefits from going to spouses who marry for financial gain. If evidence emerges that a spouse targeted the beneficiary specifically for their wealth, the character clause activates and blocks all community property claims. Patricia pulled out the most important document in the folder. Rose required that any future husband submit to a complete financial disclosure and background check before gaining any access to inheritance benefits. Marcus would have needed to provide 10 years of tax returns, employment records, and personal references. He never did that. No, he didn't. Which means he never qualified for community property protections under Rose's estate plan. But here's the brilliant part. Rose made the character clause retroactive. Even if Marcus had submitted to the background check and lied on his application, the clause would still activate when we proved his deception. I was beginning to understand the full scope of Rose's strategy. She hadn't just protected the money, she had created a legal trap that would spring shut the moment Marcus revealed his true intentions. So when Marcus files for divorce and claims half the inheritance, the character clause activates automatically. All of our evidence becomes part of the court record. Marcus's history of financial fraud, his recorded conversations about targeting you, his pattern of predatory behavior with wealthy women. All of it gets presented to the judge. But even as I felt the satisfaction of Rose's foresight, I realized we had a problem. "Patricia, Marcus isn't just planning to claim the inheritance. He's going to argue that Rose was mentally incompetent when she established the trust. He's documented my grief as evidence of family instability." Patricia's expression darkened. He's going to attack Rose's mental state? It's all in his divorce strategy document. He thinks if he can prove Rose was suffering from dementia or undue influence, he can invalidate the entire estate plan. That son of a bitch. Rose anticipated that possibility, too. She pulled out one final folder, this one sealed with red wax. Rose underwent comprehensive psychological evaluation 6 months before she died. Cognitive function tests, memory assessments, mental competency examinations, everything administered by court-approved neurologists and psychiatrists. The medical records were thorough and unambiguous. Rose had scored in the 95th percentile for cognitive function in her age group. The evaluating doctors had declared her mentally sharp, legally competent, and fully capable of making complex financial decisions.
But that's not even the best part. Rose also videotaped detailed explanations of every aspect of her estate planning, specifically addressing the possibility that someone might challenge her mental competency. She spent 4 hours on camera walking through her investment strategies, explaining her legal reasoning, and demonstrating perfect recall of financial details going back decades. She really thought of everything. Your grandmother was the smartest client I've ever represented, Patricia said, and she loved you more than life itself. She knew that someday a man like Marcus might try to destroy you, and she spent her final months building an impenetrable fortress around your inheritance. I felt tears threatening, but they weren't the grief tears I'd been crying for 2 years. These were tears of gratitude and love and fierce pride in the woman who had raised me. But Patricia wasn't finished. There's one more thing, Sarah. Rose's investigation uncovered evidence that Marcus might have one final card to play, something desperate and potentially dangerous. What kind of dangerous? The private investigator found evidence that Marcus has been in contact with some unsavory people in Las Vegas, people who specialize in making wealthy individuals disappear when legal methods fail. Rose was worried that if Marcus couldn't get your money through divorce, he might try other methods. A chill ran down my spine. You think he'd try to hurt me? I think desperate people do desperate things, and Marcus has invested too much time in this game to walk away empty-handed. Just be careful, Sarah. Don't let him know you suspect anything. Don't change your routine or give him any reason to accelerate his timeline. I drove Huyn in a daze, my head spinning with the magnitude of what I'd learned. Rose had spent her final months waging a secret war to protect me from a threat I hadn't even recognized. Marcus had been planning my destruction for years, documenting my vulnerabilities and building a case to steal everything Rose had died to preserve. But Rose had outmaneuvered him at every step. Our plan was foolproof, but Patricia's warning echoed in my mind. Marcus might have one final card to play, and if we were wrong about his desperation, I could lose everything Rose had died to protect. As I pulled into our driveway, I saw Marcus through the kitchen window making dinner and humming to himself. He looked so normal, so innocent. If I hadn't spent the afternoon reviewing evidence of his betrayal, I might have walked inside and told him about my day, asked about his work, maybe suggested we watch a movie together. Instead, I sat in my car for 5 minutes, practicing my smile and preparing to lie to the man who'd been lying to me for 6 years. The next 3 weeks were going to determine whether Rose's final gift to me would be justice or whether Marcus's desperation would destroy us both.
Those 3 weeks were the longest of my life. Every morning I woke up next to Marcus and practiced being the grieving, emotional wife he thought he was manipulating. Every evening, I listened to him make phone calls in the garage and pretended I didn't know he was coordinating his attack on Rose's estate. Marcus's behavior became increasingly strange as his self-imposed deadline approached. He started staying out later, claiming work events that I knew were meetings with his attorney. He bought new clothes, expensive suits that cost more than his monthly salary. He even had the audacity to ask if I wanted to go car shopping together. For what? I asked, looking up from Rose's financial statements that I was pretending to struggle with. I've been thinking we need something more reliable than your Honda, Marcus said, scrolling through luxury car listings on his phone. Maybe a BMW or Mercedes, something that reflects our financial position. Our financial position. He was already spending my inheritance in his head. Marcus, those cars cost $60,000 or more. We can't afford that. He gave me that patronizing smile I'd grown to hate. Sarah, sweetheart, you're thinking too small. With the equity in the house and your inheritance, we're wealthy people now. We should start acting like it. 3 days before Marcus planned to file for divorce, I got a call from Patricia. He just served you papers, she said without preamble. My contact at the courthouse says David Chen filed the petition this morning. You should expect a process server within the hour. My hand started shaking. Even though I'd been expecting this moment for weeks, the reality of it hit like a physical blow.
What do I do? Exactly what we practiced. Act surprised. Act hurt. Call me crying. Let Marcus think he's got you completely off guard. Can you do that? Yes. My voice was steadier than I felt. Patricia, what if something goes wrong? What if the judge doesn't believe our evidence? Sarah, listen to me. Rose spent 2 years building an airtight case. We have recordings, photographs, financial records, testimony from other victims, and legal protections that Marcus doesn't even know exist. He's walking into a trap that was set before he ever met you. The process server arrived 20 minutes later. Marcus was at work, so I signed for the divorce papers alone in our kitchen, standing in the same spot where I'd confronted him about researching Rose's estate. The irony wasn't lost on me. I called Marcus first, sobbing into the phone. Marcus, someone just served me with divorce papers. What's happening? Why are you doing this? Sarah, I'm so sorry. His voice was perfectly calibrated, concerned but firm, like he'd practiced this conversation. I didn't want you to find out this way. I was going to talk to you tonight. Find out what? Marcus, I don't understand. I thought we were happy. We need to talk. I'm coming home. Marcus arrived 30 minutes later with flowers and his lawyer's business card. He sat me down at our kitchen table and delivered what was clearly a prepared speech about how our marriage wasn't working, how my grief was affecting our relationship, how we both deserved to be happy. I've already spoken to an attorney, he said, sliding David Chen's card across the table. I think we can work out a fair settlement without a lot of conflict. Split everything 50-50, keep this civilized. 50-50? I let my voice break. Marcus, most of our assets are my inheritance. That money was Rose's. Sarah, we're married. What's yours is mine, legally speaking. That's how community property works in Arizona. I stared at him through my tears, marveling at his ability to lie so smoothly. He genuinely believed he'd outmaneuvered me, that his years of manipulation and documentation had guaranteed his victory. I need to call my own attorney, I said weakly. Of course, that's your right. But Sarah, please don't make this harder than it has to be. I'm trying to be fair here. Fair. The man who'd married me for my money, who'd planned to argue that my dying grandmother was mentally incompetent, who'd spent 6 years lying to my face, was trying to be fair? I called Patricia from our bedroom, making sure Marcus could hear me crying through the door. Patricia, he filed for divorce. He wants half of everything. Rose's house, Rose's money. Everything. What do I do? We fight, Patricia said loudly enough for Marcus to hear. Sarah, I know this is scary, but we're going to protect Rose's estate. That money stays in your family, where it belongs. Marcus was smiling when I came out of the bedroom. He thought Patricia was going to put up a traditional defense, maybe argue about the timing of the inheritance or the complexity of the trust. He had no idea we were about to destroy his entire life. The first court hearing was scheduled for the following Wednesday. Marcus spent the weekend preparing, meeting with David Chen, organizing documents, practicing his testimony about my emotional instability and his contributions to our marriage. I spent the weekend with Patricia, reviewing our evidence one final time and preparing for what she called the most satisfying moment of her 40-year legal career. Wednesday morning arrived gray and drizzling, typical Phoenix weather for late spring. I dressed carefully in a conservative black suit, playing the role of the grieving widow who was about to lose her grandmother's legacy. Marcus wore his most expensive new suit, the one he'd bought with money he expected to have after the divorce. The Superior Court of Maricopa County was busier than I had expected. Dozens of cases were being heard that morning, but word had somehow gotten out about our hearing. I spotted 3 reporters in the gallery, drawn by whispers of a high-dollar inheritance dispute. Judge Martinez called our case at 10:30. She was a stern woman in her early 60s, with steel gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. Patricia had researched her extensively. 23 years on the bench, a reputation for thorough case review, and zero tolerance for legal fraud. Marcus and David Chen sat at the plaintiff's table, their evidence boxes stacked neatly beside them. Marcus caught my eye and gave me what he probably thought was a sympathetic smile. Even now, even in divorce court, he was still performing the role of concerned husband. Your Honor, David Chen began, standing with practiced confidence. My client, Marcus Mitchell, is seeking dissolution of marriage and equitable distribution of marital assets. The marriage has become untenable due to Mr. Mitchell's inability to process grief in a healthy manner, and my client believes both parties would benefit from a clean separation. David outlined Marcus's case methodically. The inheritance had been received during the marriage, making it community property. Marcus had provided emotional support during my period of grief, justifying spousal support. The couple had made joint decisions about the inherited property, establishing his equitable interest. It was a competent presentation, built on solid legal precedent and Marcus's careful documentation of my emotional state. If I'd been the helpless, grief-stricken widow Marcus believed me to be, his case would have been devastating. Furthermore, David continued, my client has concerns about Mrs. Mitchell's ability to manage substantial financial assets in her current emotional state. The inheritance in question exceeds $1.8 million, and Mrs. Mitchell has shown poor judgment in financial planning since receiving these assets. Judge Martinez listened without expression, taking notes on David's arguments. When he finished, she turned to Patricia. Counselor, how does your client respond to these claims? Patricia stood slowly, like a lioness preparing to strike. Your Honor, Mrs. Hartwell, she's reclaimed her maiden name, has some additional evidence the court should consider before making any determinations about asset distribution. What kind of additional evidence? Evidence that fundamentally changes the nature of this case, Your Honor. Evidence that was specifically prepared for this exact situation by the decedent who established the inheritance trust. Marcus shifted in his chair. This wasn't going according to his script. Patricia handed me the manila envelope we'd prepared, the one containing Rose's sealed affidavit and private investigator report. My hands were steady as I approached the bench, even though my heart was racing. Your Honor, this envelope was left in my grandmother's estate specifically to be opened if anyone challenged my inheritance rights. It contains information about the true nature of my marriage and my husband's motives.
Judge Martinez accepted the envelope and broke the wax seal. The courtroom went completely silent, except for the whisper of paper and the distant hum of air conditioning. I returned to my seat and watched Marcus's face. He was trying to look curious rather than panicked, but I could see the fear in his eyes. David Chen was leaning over, whispering urgently in his ear, probably asking what could possibly be in Rose's papers that would affect their case. Judge Martinez read for several minutes, her expression growing more serious with each page. Finally, she looked up. Mr. Chen, were you aware that Mrs. Hartwell's grandmother had your client investigated by a private detective during his engagement to her granddaughter? The color drained from David Chen's face. I'm sorry, Your Honor. According to this affidavit, Rose Hartwell hired a private investigator to conduct a comprehensive background check on Marcus Mitchell in 2018. The investigation revealed a pattern of targeting wealthy women for fraudulent romantic relationships. Marcus shot up from his chair. Your Honor, that's impossible. I never... Mr. Mitchell, please remain seated, Judge Martinez commanded. Mr. Chen, did your client disclose his previous relationships with Jennifer Walsh in San Francisco, Rebecca Torres in San Diego, or Amanda Fletcher in Colorado? David Chen looked like he wanted to disappear. Your Honor, I was not made aware of any previous relationships that would be relevant to this case. All three women were targeted by your client for their substantial inheritances, Judge Martinez continued, reading from Rose's investigator's report. In each case, Mr. Mitchell engaged in romantic relationships with the specific goal of gaining access to family wealth through marriage. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. I heard one of the reporters gasp audibly.
Marcus had gone completely pale, his confident demeanor crumbling in real time. But Judge Martinez wasn't finished. Mr. Chen, are you familiar with the concept of a character clause in estate planning? A character clause, Your Honor? Patricia stood. Your Honor, may I explain the relevant estate provision? Please do, Counselor. Rose Hartwell included a character clause in her estate planning that specifically addresses inheritance rights for spouses who marry beneficiaries under fraudulent pretenses. Any individual who targets a beneficiary for their wealth forfeits all community property claims to inherited assets. The judge nodded. Mr. Mitchell, according to this evidence, you researched Mrs. Hartwell's family wealth extensively before initiating your relationship with her. Is this accurate? Marcus was whispering frantically with David Chen, but his attorney looked like he was ready to bolt from the courtroom. The ethical implications of representing a client who had lied about the fundamental basis of their case were becoming clear. Your Honor, David said, his voice notably lacking its earlier confidence, my client would like to request a brief recess to review this new evidence. Mr. Chen, did you conduct adequate discovery regarding your client's background before filing this petition? The silence was damning. David Chen had been blindsided as completely as his client. Your Honor, based on the information presented to me, I believed... Mr. Chen. Judge Martinez's voice cut through his explanation like a blade. Did or did you not verify your client's claims about the nature of this marriage before demanding half of a protected inheritance? David Chen looked at Marcus, then back at the judge, then at the exit. I could see him calculating whether his professional reputation could survive this case. Your Honor, I need to consult with my client privately. The evidence presented today was not disclosed during our case preparation. Patricia stood again. Your Honor, if I may, present additional evidence while counsel confers with his client. Proceed. Patricia approached the bench with a second folder, this one containing the recorded phone conversations between Marcus and Jennifer Walsh. Your Honor, these are authenticated recordings of the defendant discussing his fraudulent intentions with a previous victim. The conversations were made during his engagement to my client and clearly establish his predatory pattern. Judge Martinez accepted the folder and headphones. For 5 minutes, the entire courtroom watched her listen to Marcus's voice describing his plan to manipulate me for my inheritance. Her expression grew darker with each passing minute. Meanwhile, David Chen was having what appeared to be a heated conversation with Marcus near the courtroom windows. I could see Marcus gesturing desperately, probably trying to explain why he'd lied about the fundamental facts of his case. When Judge Martinez finished listening to the recordings, she removed the headphones and looked directly at Marcus. Mr. Mitchell, I've just listened to recordings of you describing your marriage as a financial strategy and your wife as a target to be exploited. Do you dispute the authenticity of these recordings? Marcus stood slowly, his hands shaking. Your Honor, those conversations were taken out of context. I was upset, saying things I didn't mean. Mr. Mitchell, you specifically stated that you researched your wife's inheritance before proposing marriage. You described her emotional vulnerability as an asset to be exploited. You discussed timeline strategies for maximizing your community property claims. Which part was taken out of context? David Chen suddenly stood. Your Honor, I need to withdraw as counsel from Mr. Mitchell. Ethical considerations prevent me from continuing this representation. The courtroom erupted. I'd never seen a lawyer abandon a client in the middle of a hearing, but David Chen was already packing his briefcase. He'd realized that continuing to represent Marcus could cost him his law license. Mr. Chen, are you withdrawing from this case? Yes, Your Honor. I was not provided with accurate information about the nature of this marriage or my client's background. I cannot ethically continue under these circumstances. Marcus watched his attorney walk out of the courtroom, leaving him completely defenseless with damning evidence piling up around him. He turned to look at me, and for the first time since I'd known him, I saw real fear in his eyes. Judge Martinez consulted her notes. Mr. Mitchell, you are now representing yourself in this proceeding. Do you have any response to the evidence that you married Mrs. Hartwell specifically to gain access to her inheritance? Marcus opened his mouth, but no sound came out. What could he possibly say?
The recordings were his own voice. The investigator's report documented his pattern with other women. Rose's character clause made his fraud legally irrelevant to asset distribution. Your Honor, Patricia said, approaching the bench one final time, there's one more provision in Rose Hartwell's estate planning that the court should consider. She handed Judge Martinez a final document. Not only does the character clause prevent Mr. Mitchell from claiming any inheritance assets, but it also makes him financially responsible for all legal costs associated with defending against his fraudulent claims. Marcus thought public humiliation was the worst thing that could happen to him. He had no idea Rose's final surprise was still coming.
Judge Martinez read the final document with the same methodical care she'd applied to everything else that morning. When she finished, she looked up at Marcus with something approaching disgust. Mr. Mitchell, not only will you receive no assets from this marriage, but under the terms of Rose Hartwell's estate provisions, you are personally responsible for all legal fees associated with defending against your fraudulent claims. That includes Mrs. Hartwell's attorney fees, court costs, and the expense of the private investigation that documented your deceptive behavior. Marcus gripped the edge of the defendant's table. How much? According to the documentation provided, approximately $47,000 in attorney fees and investigation costs, plus an additional $8,000 in court fees and administrative expenses. $55,000, more than Marcus's annual salary, and that was before considering David Chen's fees for the representation he'd just abandoned. But Judge Martinez wasn't finished. Furthermore, this court finds that your behavior constitutes attempted inheritance fraud under Arizona state law. I am ordering a full investigation by the Attorney General's office and referring this case for potential criminal prosecution. The courtroom was completely silent. Even the reporters had stopped writing, mesmerized by the complete destruction of Marcus's life playing out in real time. The divorce is granted, Judge Martinez concluded. All inheritance assets remain the separate property of Sarah Hartwell. Mr. Mitchell's community property claims are denied in their entirety under the character clause provisions. This court is adjourned. The gavel came down with a finality that echoed through the courtroom like thunder. Marcus sat in stunned silence as people began filing out around him. His face had gone from pale to gray, and I could see his hands trembling as the full weight of his situation settled in. No inheritance, crushing debt, criminal investigation pending, and professional reputation destroyed. Patricia squeezed my shoulder as we gathered our papers. Rose would be so proud, she whispered. I looked back at Marcus one final time as we left the courtroom. He was still sitting at the defendant's table, staring at nothing, probably trying to calculate how he would survive the financial and legal disaster he'd created for himself. Sarah, Marcus called my name as I reached the courtroom doors. We need to talk about this. This isn't over. I turned to face the man who'd spent 6 years lying to me, manipulating me, and planning to destroy my grandmother's legacy. Marcus, it was over the moment you decided to marry me for my money, instead of loving me for who I am. The character clause didn't ruin your plan. Your greed did. His face crumpled as the full reality hit him. No inheritance, no assets, and crushing debt that would follow him for years. The man who'd charmed his way through life had finally met a situation that couldn't be smooth-talked or manipulated away. The aftermath was swift and brutal. Word spread through Phoenix's tight-knit professional community within hours. Marcus's pharmaceutical company fired him by the end of the week, citing moral turpitude clauses in his employment contract. The criminal investigation made him unemployable in medical sales, and background checks would reveal the court proceedings to any future employer. Marcus was forced to declare bankruptcy within 2 months, but the debt to Rose's estate couldn't be discharged. It would follow him for the rest of his life, accruing interest and ensuring he'd never be able to rebuild any kind of wealth. He moved back in with his parents in Tucson, a 47-year-old man reduced to living in his childhood bedroom and working entry-level retail jobs. His dating life became non-existent as women in Arizona learned about his scheme through social media and local news coverage. But Marcus's downfall was just the beginning of what Rose had planned. 3 days after the court hearing, Patricia asked me to come to her office again.
She had something else to show me, something even she hadn't known about until she'd opened Rose's final sealed instructions. "Your grandmother left one more surprise," Patricia said, pulling out a folder I'd never seen before. "She established a scholarship fund as part of her estate, but the instructions were sealed until after your inheritance was protected." Inside the folder was documentation for the Rose Hartwell Foundation for Financial Independence, a scholarship and legal aid program for women escaping financially abusive relationships. Rose had survived her own financially abusive marriage in the 1960s. Thomas Hartwell wasn't just a gold digger, he was emotionally and financially controlling, isolating her from friends and family, making her dependent on his approval for every financial decision. When she finally escaped, she had to rebuild her entire life from nothing. I stared at the scholarship documents, finally understanding the full scope of Rose's vision. This wasn't just about protecting one inheritance from one predator. This was about breaking a cycle of financial abuse that had been going on for generations. The entire inheritance protection strategy was Rose's way of making sure other women wouldn't face what she did. She spent 60 years building wealth and legal expertise specifically to help women protect themselves from financial predators. Rose turned her trauma into a weapon for justice. Her marriage to Thomas Hartwell had taught her how predators operated, and she'd spent the rest of her life developing strategies to defeat them. "There's more," Patricia said, pulling out the final document. Rose wanted the court case with Marcus to serve as a precedent for character clause enforcement. She worked with legal scholars to ensure that other attorneys could use your case as a model for protecting inherited wealth from fraudulent spouses. The Rose Hartwell Foundation would help women in 3 ways: scholarships for women leaving abusive relationships, legal aid for protecting assets during divorces, and education programs about financial independence and predator recognition. I signed the foundation paperwork that afternoon, officially becoming the administrator of Rose's final gift to the world. Over the next few months, I worked with Patricia to establish the program and begin accepting applications. The first scholarship recipient was Jennifer Walsh, the tech widow from San Francisco, who'd provided crucial testimony against Marcus. She wanted to go back to school for a law degree, specifically to help other women fight inheritance fraud. My own transformation was more gradual, but just as profound. I moved back into Rose's Craftsman house permanently, finally understanding that it wasn't just a property, it was a fortress she'd built to protect our family's values across generations. I expanded Hartwell Financial Planning to specialize in asset protection for women, offering services that went beyond traditional financial advice. We helped clients establish trusts, create character clauses, and develop legal strategies for protecting wealth from predatory relationships. The work was deeply satisfying in ways I'd never experienced before. Every woman we helped felt like honoring Rose's memory. Every predator we defeated felt like justice served. Within a year, Hartwell Financial Planning had become the go-to firm in Arizona for women seeking to protect inherited wealth. We had 12 employees, offices in Phoenix and Tucson, and a waiting list of clients who'd heard about our success in the Marcus Mitchell case. But the deeper victory wasn't professional or financial. I'd inherited more than Rose's money. I'd inherited her wisdom about recognizing who truly valued me versus who valued what I had. The court case became a landmark precedent for character clause enforcement, cited in law journals and used as a model by estate attorneys across the country. Rose's legal strategy was studied in law schools as an example of comprehensive asset protection planning. More importantly, Rose's memory was protected from Marcus's greed permanently. He'd tried to desecrate our legacy and steal her life's work, but instead, he'd helped create a legal framework that would protect countless other families from similar predators. The irony was perfect. In trying to steal Rose's legacy, Marcus had actually helped ensure it would live forever.
Looking back now, 3 years after that courtroom confrontation, I sometimes wonder about the moral complexity of what Rose and I did to Marcus. Was I executing justice? Or was I simply getting revenge with better lawyers? Rose's character clause was completely legal. Patricia made sure of that. But was it fair to trap Marcus with documents he never knew existed? He signed our prenup without reading it, which was his choice, but he had no way of knowing that Rose was building a comprehensive case against him from the moment we got engaged. On one hand, Marcus was a predator who'd spent years targeting vulnerable women for their wealth. He'd destroyed other lives before mine, and he would have destroyed more if we hadn't stopped him. The evidence was overwhelming. Recorded conversations, financial documents, testimony from previous victims. This wasn't a case of mistaken motives or miscommunication. Marcus deliberately married me to steal my inheritance. But on the other hand, Rose's strategy was so elaborate, so comprehensive, that it feels almost like overkill. She didn't just protect my inheritance, she engineered Marcus's complete financial and social destruction. The criminal investigation, the bankruptcy, the professional ruin that followed him back to his parents' house in Tucson. Was all of that proportional to his crime? I think about Jennifer Walsh sometimes, the tech widow from San Francisco who provided crucial testimony against Marcus. She told me that Marcus's betrayal nearly destroyed her ability to trust anyone. She'd spent 2 years in therapy, learning to rebuild her sense of self-worth after discovering that someone she'd loved had viewed her as nothing more than a financial target. Marcus caused real harm to real people. But does that justify the level of destruction Rose's plan ultimately caused him? Then again, maybe I'm overthinking this. Marcus made his choices. He chose to research my family's wealth before approaching me at Rose's funeral. He chose to lie about his motives for 6 years. He chose to document my grief as evidence of mental instability. He chose to plan my destruction while pretending to love me. Every step of his downfall was a direct consequence of decisions he made freely, with full knowledge that he was defrauding the women he claimed to care about. Rose's character clause wasn't just about protecting one inheritance from one predator, it was about creating a legal framework that would protect other families from similar schemes. The precedent our case established has been used dozens of times since then, helping other women defend their assets from fraudulent spouses. The Scholarship Foundation has helped 43 women so far, providing legal aid and financial independence training to women escaping abusive relationships. Jennifer Walsh graduated law school last year and now works exclusively on inheritance fraud cases. The ripple effects of Rose's strategy continue to protect and empower women across the country. But here's what I keep coming back to. Rose didn't just give me the tools to destroy Marcus, she gave me the choice. She could have activated the character clause automatically, could have exposed Marcus's fraud without involving me in the process. Instead, she left me that sealed envelope and trusted me to decide when and how to use the weapon she'd built. That choice mattered. It meant I wasn't just a victim of Marcus's scheme or a beneficiary of Rose's protection. I was an active participant in seeking justice, making conscious decisions about how to respond to betrayal. Maybe that's the real difference between justice and revenge. Justice involves choice, consideration, and proportional response. Revenge is about inflicting maximum damage regardless of consequences. Rose's plan was elaborate, but it was also carefully calibrated. Marcus lost his claim to my inheritance, faced consequences for his fraudulent behavior, and was prevented from targeting other women. But he wasn't physically harmed, and he retained the ability to rebuild his life if he chose to change his behavior. The fact that he ended up bankrupt and unemployable was largely due to his own choices, lying to his attorney, continuing to lie under oath, and having built his entire adult life around schemes that couldn't survive legal scrutiny. Still, I wonder sometimes about the ethics of Rose's approach. Should inheritance laws include character requirements for spouses? Is it fair to judge someone's worthiness based on their motives for marriage? Where's the line between protecting assets and controlling relationships? These are complicated questions, and I don't have simple answers. What I do know is that Rose's strategy worked. It protected our family's wealth,
helped other women in similar situations, and ensured that a dangerous predator faced meaningful consequences for his actions. I also know that living through Marcus's betrayal and Rose's elaborate response changed me in ways I'm still discovering. I'm more cautious about trusting people, but also more confident in my ability to recognize deception. I'm more protective of my assets, but also more generous with my resources when helping other women. The experience taught me that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is prepare for the worst while hoping for the best. Rose's elaborate legal protections weren't cynical, they were realistic. She understood that wealth makes you a target, and she refused to let me face that reality unprepared. So let me ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest in your comments below. If you discovered that your spouse had married you specifically for your money, if you had recordings of them planning to steal your family's legacy, if you had evidence that they'd done this to other people before you, what would you do? Would you use every legal weapon available to protect yourself and prevent them from targeting others? Or would you take that people call the high road and settle for a simple divorce without consequences? And here's the harder question. What if your grandmother had left you the same choice Rose left me? What if you had the power to completely destroy someone who'd spent years lying to you and planning your destruction? Would you use it? Tell me in the comments. Would you have stopped after protecting the inheritance? Or would you have finished what Rose started? Would you have felt guilty about the scholarship foundation that was built on Marcus's downfall? Or proud that something good came from something terrible? I read every single comment, and I'm genuinely curious about your thoughts. Because 3 years later, I'm still not entirely sure whether I was an instrument of justice or just someone who got really, really good revenge. But I do know this. Rose's roses bloom more beautifully every year, and every woman we've helped through the foundation gets to keep her grandmother's legacy safe from predators. Maybe that's justice enough.